2024 has become a big year for body horror, and partly because of the success of The Substance. I'm a body horror lover, and we found that out when we did a ranking of horror themes and subgenres. If it's body horror, I'm there. But I wanted to see how far I could go. Enter the disturbing body horror iceberg. Like all icebergs, I found this one circulating on Reddit. I did not make it. Thank you so much to inserted edgy 2014 meme. I like exploring other people's icebergs, even though I might be working on my own. I find it really fun to explore new films and see what other people would put on their own iceberg. And this is gonna be the start of a long exploration. I don't agree with everything on this iceberg, and we will tackle that as we go. Keep in mind, the traditional idea of an iceberg is that a lot of the mainstream stuff is on top, and as we venture down to the depths, down to the darkness, you'll find obscure things that are a lot harder to access. I don't know a lot of these films at the bottom. I'm a little bit scared, just a little bit. This is the biggest project I've ever taken on within my last decade on YouTube, and because of that, I want to give it the time it deserves. So inspired by one of my favorite YouTubers, a friend and an explorer of disturbing icebergs, Hannah the Horrible, I'm going to separate this one into sections. So make sure you're subscribed for all parts of this iceberg. But what is body horror? Body horror is known as biological horror, organic horror, visceral horror, or horror fiction, in which the horror is principally derived from the unnatural graphic transformation, degeneration, or destruction of the physical body. Huge warning for visual spoilers and spoilers of plot lines within this video. I avoid spoiling the plot or the whole film where I can, but usually the body horror has a lot to do with the film and the reveals. What's the point in doing a video about extreme body horror and not discussing that? So please skip around using chapters if you wish. Okay, are we set? Are we ready to go? Oh, are you wondering? Yeah, this shirt. I made these shirts to commemorate this video. I've been deeply inspired by Daddy Cronenberg after going through this list. He is a master. I've always loved David Cronenberg and his films and what he stands for. And I just couldn't think of a better thing to put on a shirt, honestly. If you'd like your very own Daddy Cronenberg t-shirt, they're available now at spookyastronauts.com. They're in black and white. Okay, let's start. I hope you have a snack ready. This is gonna be wild. We start at the very top with District 9. I had seen District 9 when it first came out, and that was back around 2009. Upon a rewatch, I was floored by this film. It was perhaps better than I remembered. The film starts as a found footage mockumentary and is about the separation of aliens and humans when aliens seek refuge on Earth. These aliens are sent to an isolated camp called District 9. But when a naive field agent is infected by a liquid made by the aliens, it begins to change them. I never thought of this as a body horror film before, and let me tell you, this whole list has really tested my thoughts and ideas around what is considered a body horror. I thought of it more of a strange mix of sci-fi, comedy, and action, but its themes are in fact very textbook body horror, with the transformation of the main character physically in a very grotesque manner, and how that changes how he's treated on the other side of the fence. The main message of the film isn't even subtext, it's blatantly about the apartheid era. Should it be placed at the top of the iceberg? Yes, I think it works perfectly as an entrance into body horror, and it was a mainstream film that a lot of people watched in large groups. It wasn't really a body horror that was shunned by any means. I know District 10 has been in development for a long time, but after rewatching this, I really hope it happens one day. The next film we're going to talk about is The Thing. I don't know why they just didn't list both movies' years instead of 1982 and Prequel, but nevertheless, The Thing is a great introduction to body horror. It's just a great body horror in general, and a very classic one at that, especially given the 80s version with the practical effects. The film utilized an insane amount of techniques such as gelatin flesh, rubber veins, and amputee stand-ins. Yes, yes, for this infamous shot, this was a person with limb loss past their forearm. And yes, they used hydraulics to rip the bodies apart. And of course, some good old-fashioned pulley systems. The dog in this one was one of the most unique parts of the film. Legend Stan Winston came in to work on just this puppet. I still can't believe that this is a puppet with an animatronic face. The 1982 version of The Thing is about a research team in Antarctica that is targeted by a shape-shifting entity. The whole idea of The Thing is it could be anyone, and in this isolated environment, it makes for one of the most paranoid films of all time. The 2011 Thing, being a prequel, takes place at the same station. The films both have the same level of gore, but it's just applied in different ways. Some scenes appear more dramatic in the prequel because of the utilization of CGI. Nothing was out of bounds. But the original is so much more intense psychologically because of the masterful use of paranoia and surprise, relying on more of the timing and lighting than just the monster itself. Although I will say in the 2011 version, there are some pretty brutal shots. Both represent the transformation and destruction of the human body in unique ways. Yes, this should be on the surface level tier. It's a very famous film, both films, but especially the 82 version. Next, we have Annihilation. This is a beautiful sci-fi horror thriller directed by Alex Garland, and the cast is killer. I'm not going to talk about the cast too much in these films, but come on, Natalie Portman, Oscar Isaac, Jennifer Jason Leigh. But I am glad that this is in the first tier because with everything else going on with this film, I've never really thought of it or seen it referred to as a body horror. Although its cosmic horror elements do have some overlap. The film is about a biologist, an anthropologist, a psychologist, a surveyor, and a linguistic who go together on a top secret expedition into a zone dubbed the Shimmer. What we know about humankind is tested here, and there are some intense metaphorical battles, so it definitely plays into that side of body horror with a sci-fi approach. We even see a bear mutated and changed by the Shimmer in one of the most chilling scenes. So it's very interesting from a metaphysical standpoint. I love this film. I'm glad it's here because I just love talking about Annihilation, but I'm also glad it's towards the top. I don't feel like it's deep niche body horror by any means. Probably doesn't really need to be on this list, more of a cosmic horror, but I'll accept it. It's strange because this next entry is pure body horror, and I feel like we went from 0 to 100 really quick. Planet Terror. This is body horror done right, and it's a great example of the genre. The film, originally part of the Grindhouse double feature, was released as a standalone in many countries. In this film, we follow Cherry Darling as a go-go dancer who wants to be a comedian, but gets mixed up in a national disaster. The storyline is so wild. Why they have to put that she wants to be a comedian, and they actually link it into the storyline. There's just so much going on. But this national disaster happens when a bioweapon is released in her town, turning people into zombies. Of course. Now Cherry teams up with some of the unaffected locals in hopes to survive. There is a lot of body horror aspects in this film. It's an ode to 70s exploitation grindhouse films, but they managed to sneak in some shots that wouldn't even have made the cut back then. And then of course there's some great gore shots of the affected people, but perhaps the best body horror transformation in this whole film happens to Cherry herself. She loses a leg due to an accident and transforms literally into a weapon herself. Because her character is unappreciated and undermined throughout the film, she uses this to take charge and fight back. There's also this disgusting scene which uses Quentin Tarantino as an actor whose member is disfigured. So there's a lot of body horror going on in different ways. But while everyone's falling apart, she uses her horror to survive. The film has some truly epic moments, and I think it could have gone down further if anything, because some of these scenes are just absolutely wild. This is why I love doing these videos, because I have never seen the classic Akira before. and I got to watch it while doing research for this, and I am so glad. This video has brought me a true classic. I don't know why it took me so long to watch this film. This has been my to-watch list for so long. It's bewildering to me that this film is from the late 80s. I can truly see why it made such a mark. And in terms of body horror, we're talking about one scene in particular that happens. The whole film is based on a manga of the same name. The film is usually labeled as a cyberpunk action animation and takes place in the dystopian year of 2019 when a military project takes a member of a biker gang to their top secret facility where he develops telekinetic powers. Drunk on this power, he turns evil, and now only his biker gang friends can stop him. It's not straightforward at all. The lore runs really deep in this film, and the last 20 minutes shows the change in the character's body, as before, the transformation had just been psychological. Although a lot of people talk about the toy scene in this film as being the most horrific. We see the transformation take hold at the end of the film, which shows the true horror of what he has become, both to himself and to the outside world. It's an amazing scene in a great film that truly inspired so many other horror movies to come. It's a pivotal piece of body horror, and I'm glad it's on this list. If anything, I think it should be at least maybe one tier further down. Let's talk about The Fly though. I'm very psyched. This is our first Cronenberg today, I think, because we're talking about the 1986 The Fly and The Fly 2. The Fly remake is one that is forever synonymous with the term body horror. This is definitely one that inspires newer films such as The Substance, which unfortunately a lot of newer films aren't on this list because it was made a while ago. The film is about a scientist attempting to change the world with new technology, but the testing stage goes horribly wrong and he is fused with a fly. The film on the surface is a discussion on bodily autonomy, and there are so many theories about the deeper metaphors of this film. Some say it's abortion as it becomes an integral part of the plot. Some say it's about the AIDS epidemic or the story of a terminal disease that you become. I really don't think anyone's wrong. There's a lot you can take out of this film. I believe the movie is about the devastating acceptance of transformation in its most purest, clean-cut form, although I feel like the film also says a lot about man playing God, which we'll see in other scientist body horror films. One thing is for certain, the film literally oozes gore and devastation. The film's makeup and practical effects were extensive, with Jeff Goldblum requiring up to 5 hours of makeup and special effects application. Imagine sitting there that long to look that decomposed. Wild. Some of the scenes didn't even make the final cut because they didn't look as realistic as Cronenberg had envisioned. The film is considered to have one of the most haunting transformations of all time. Vincent Price, star of the original, said that he enjoyed the remake, but he felt like they went a little bit too far. Which I love. As for the sequel, we follow the spawn of Seth, Martin, who is born seemingly normal, but is the subject to testing as he grows. Brought up in a science facility, he attempts to fix his father's work, but what he doesn't know is he is about to transform. The film has some unique moments, including the testing on a dog, which, don't worry, it's very obvious when they switch this out for an animatronic, but it is really cruel as the story progresses. But ultimately, we're just waiting for his transformation, and the film doesn't separate itself at all from the original in terms of the story. We get a very similar looking early transition, if not slightly more reptilian-like, and as Martin's body changes, so does his mind, as he goes from a sweet man to an egotistical fly. Perhaps a metaphor for his condition that he inherited, not just in his DNA, but in his personality, echoing his mad scientist's father's ego. I have to admit, the second part of the transformation in this film is very special, but I can't help now thinking that it echoes The Substance. The first film is a lot more effective in the tragedy element, but the gore in this film does go to another level, which I was not expecting. We get a very intense final form. They aimed more for scary than tragic in this one. The Fly 2 visually should get a little bit more credit. It is body horror done right, although I think the story could use some work, and it will always live in the 1896 version's shadow. I have been singing praises for the next film for years, but I'm really shocked that it's this high on this tier. It is very disturbing and quite niche. It's also very different to the last entry because it's completely psychological and not really gory that much at all. And I also want to give a warning. I know I gave a warning at the start, but there are spoilers in this video, and I really hate to spoil this movie for you. So if you haven't watched it, maybe skip this one. But I'm going to tell you what happens because you need to know to understand the body horror element. This Spanish psychological thriller is about a surgeon who creates a synthetic skin that can withstand damage. We find out through the film that he creates this because his wife died in a horrific accident and he became obsessed with the idea of a technology that could have saved her. But he tests it on this seemingly mysterious woman who seems to look exactly like his wife. And this person he's keeping locked in his house against their will. We later find out the true identity of who this person actually is, and it is horrific. It's the man who sexually assaulted his daughter, and he had kidnapped him and conducted gender reassignment surgery on him against his will. He created an image of his wife within this man. It's a sick movie with a jaw-dropping twist, and it is done really well. It technically falls into body horror, I guess, but the surgeon is the main character, and there is a lot of twists and turns throughout that, and we don't really focus on the body horror element, especially from the perspective of this victim. But the idea that they're trapped into this body, it's all-consuming. The film works more to flip the narrative, making you believe that the scientist is evil for holding this innocent woman hostage, only to find out it's a story about revenge. The body horror in this one is more so implied, but I will never understand why it's so far up in this iceberg. It is a niche film, it is disturbing, and it should have been put down further if they were going to count it as body horror. This should be, at least halfway down in a psychological horror iceberg. Okay, we're at the last part of the first tier, and I couldn't be happier with the next entry. It is Hellraiser. I love Hellraiser, and although the Cenobites may seem like they are the body horror in this film, I truly believe that it is the presence of Frank which we should focus on. The original Hellraiser tells the story of Frank, who solves a demonic puzzle inviting underworld demons called Cenobites to tear his body apart. Say with me now, Jesus wept, subjecting him to extreme sadomasochism. I can't believe this is on tier 1 when I think about it. I guess we're off to a great start. Frank is then resurrected slowly by the blood of others, which he is able to get with the help of his forbidden lover. The Hellraiser story structure is extremely unique in terms of the body horror. We start with the horror and destruction that is brought on by Frank, and then he slowly becomes human-like. So the transition is opposite, and Frank's metaphor is switched. His grotesque appearance being the real him, morphing into plain sight. Frank and his lover Lisa are both seen as morally corrupt, having an affair, and of course killing people for their blood so they can regenerate Frank. People also believe that this film works as an allegory for addiction, being Frank's sadomasochistic tendencies lead him to the extreme, the destruction of his own body. Hellraiser is an amazing film for so many reasons, and the level of detail that they put into the way that the Cenobites look and the individuality, the textures, it's just insane and so classic for so many reasons. Body horror just being one. Sorry, I feel like I have something on my face. Ow, what the heck? What is that? I'll just talk this way. I don't know, it's really itchy down here. Let's move on to tier 2. When I think of David Lynch, I more so think of surrealism, but Eraserhead does fall into this category with a few elements, including his abnormal spawn and the lady in the radiator. Eraserhead takes place in an industrial universe where Henry struggles to come to terms with being a parent. Although the intent in Lynch's work is to be ambiguous, in fact, he likes people to draw their own conclusions. Eraserhead obviously demonstrates the anxieties of being a new parent with the fear of fatherhood. The radiator lady, who appears with a moon-like face, is theorized to be a delusion in which he mentally escapes to find happiness. The body elements are part of Lynch's surrealist world, and although the child may reflect a disconnect between himself and this literal alien, which is supposed to be his son, there's not much of a body horror transformation for Henry himself. It's definitely light on body horror, but heavy on surrealism. But the next film does have an epic and I'm gonna say epic, transformation. It is truly one of the best. An American Werewolf in London. I stand by this having one of the best transformation scenes of all time. At least the best werewolf. So good it made Oscar history. But the film's body horror doesn't stop there. It's the story of David and Jack, two American college students backpacking in the UK when they're attacked by a werewolf. Spoilers, of course, here. Jack dies, but David is just bitten. So now he has taken on the curse of becoming a werewolf. It's also not the end of Jack in this version of a werewolf, as the victims are cursed to walk the earth in limbo until the wolf's bloodline is severed. So in addition to being one of the greatest transformations of all time with David's character, Jack also transforms throughout the film, slowly decaying while haunting his best friend. But he is in good company because he's joined by others that are killed along the way. Makeup artist Rick Baker won an Oscar for his work on this film. In fact, it was the first year of the category of makeup for an Oscar, which is wild to think about, but very cool horror history. The focus of the transformation scenes was to show the inflicted pain on the human body. The details are in the stretch as the body transforms. The werewolf's attack scenes focused on the creature looking demonic, and this was done through movement where detailed sculptures were used. But the interesting part, the small attention to detail that everyone always talks about within this film, is the flap. This little tiny part of his skin that was ripped and was flapping away during parts of the film. But later on, of course, he decomposes into such a state that he can no longer appear as human. And at this point, they replace his body with a puppet. It's a skeleton-like duplicate of the actor with hollowed out cheeks. The message in the film is very clear. It's about loss of control, not only of your body, but of your destiny, especially at a young age. David has to take responsibility for what is happening to him in the most horrific way possible. The film deals with some really intense themes and discussions about the end of someone's life. It's an amazing film. Sorry, I'm so itchy. It's an amazing film with amazing body horror. I'm glad it's at tier 2. It is very mainstream. It won an Oscar, but it is what I think about when I think about body horror. Splice is an interesting entry because it's a sci-fi film that doesn't go full body horror until the reveal, so major spoilers in this one. In this film, we follow two genetic engineers, Clive and Elsa, who are a couple, but they're also working together on a groundbreaking project to create an animal hybrid for medical research. Pushing their experiment further, they secretly develop Dren, a female hybrid of a human with animal traits, using a Jane Doe donor. They believe that this could speed up medical research on humans, saving lives. But their experiment goes wrong as Dren begins to change too rapidly, and it's revealed that Elsa was actually the donor for Dren's inception. The couple bond with Dren, but it's not long before things get out of hand, and it becomes extremely horrific when Dren morphs into a male and becomes violent. It ends up sexually assaulting Elsa in a really horrific scene, and this results in Elsa becoming impregnated with its spawn. And she agrees to carry it to term in the name of science. Talk about playing God and also becoming the experiment yourself. The film's themes really do push the limit. Dren itself is a mix of digital creation and enhancement done on top of what was already supplied by an actor. It's estimated by the team that 95% of what was on screen is a live actor with digital augmentation, while the other 5% is completely digital. The effects worked really well for the time, but because the story isn't really focused on a transformation, it's more about nurturing a monster and the complexities that come along with destroying your own DNA, a part of you. Although we see Dren evolve, I find more body horror in what happens to Elsa because of it, psychologically and ultimately physically with the impregnation. Although we don't see this play out, I find it interesting that this is a tier lower than the other ones. I guess it feels more like a straight up sci-fi to me. There are no dates next to the next entry, so I have to assume it's the 2018 war horror movie Overlord. Although there's a slight chance they could be talking about the Japanese novel, but I don't think so. This film takes place on the eve of D-Day in 1944, we follow a group of American soldiers who are tasked in destroying a communications tower, but in their mission, they discover a hidden facility, and this is where the body horror comes in. Of course, a war story has a lot of violence, but this one also has a twist. Again, spoiler warnings. I'm sorry, it's just not within my nature to give this many spoilers in a video. In this movie, they discover a lab where this red serum has been created that transforms its subjects. It's able to reanimate humans, but also create monstrous strength and physical changes shown by disfigurement. Visually, the film is a treat. The director believed that practical effects were key in keeping the film realistic for its actors. An actor in the film told Screen Rant that he was surprised with the amount of prosthetics that were used, and it felt like it added to the performances. Visual effects were used to enhance the practical effects, but the practical effects did a lot of the heavy lifting. The film is a head-on way to explore playing God, as well as the moral question around the extent of necessary evil in war. It does what horror does best. It takes a beyond the line to explore unspeakable events. It's probably at the right tier of the iceberg as well, because although there are some horrendous crimes, it's not entirely shocking, and it's also a very accessible film, which makes the next entry so bizarre why it's up all the way at the top. Martyrs. Martyrs is in my top 10 favorite horror films of all time. The French-Canadian film usually gets put in the French extremity category because of its extreme themes and visceral moments. The film is about two traumatized women, Lucy and Anna, who seek out Lucy's childhood abusers. They enter their home and their whole family. But the film kind of twists here, where, spoiler alert, obviously, Anna is captured and held hostage by the same group that abused Lucy. And now she's going to find out what their motives were for traumatizing her friend all those years ago. The bathroom floor scene for me is the most disturbing of all. I don't know if anyone feels the same, but we meet this tortured soul and they have this thing attached to their head and it's just beyond gory nightmare fuel. But I guess the true final transformation is what they do to Lucy's body. In this film, they skin her, leaving only parts of her flesh, just enough so she can live on death's door. She is a true martyr for the purpose of finding out if there is anything after life. The thing about this film is that everything physical matches the psychological torture. It is one of one. It's the same. This is less of a metaphor for something else, but truly showing the lengths that she is pushed to by this group. Martyrs is an effective film for so many reasons, and somehow the body horror aspect is just part of the bigger picture. So I can see why it's closer to the top in that respect, as it doesn't rely on body horror for its message. So much has been taken away from both of these characters, and the last thing left is their vessel. Okay, back to Daddy Cronenberg and one of my favorites, Videodrome, which that's what this is Videodrome and The Fly. I'm sure you guys picked that up. But Videodrome is one of my favorites. This may have been my first intro to body horror. It's quite a mainstream film, being the first of Cronenberg's films that are backed by a major Hollywood station. Slightly bombed, but it became a cult classic, particularly with body horror fans, which is why it should be towards the top of this iceberg. Cronenberg likes his films with a side of eroticism, and in this film we follow Max, the president of a TV station looking for new shows, when he comes across an unauthorized showing of a program called Videodrome. In this program, people are tortured and he believes that it's staged, that it's fake. But the program is very real and it begins to brainwash him. The film is bizarre in all of the right ways. One of the most epic scenes involves him delving into himself, his own abdomen. It explores his brainwashing visually as he makes direct contact with the television, showing its alarming impact on him, expressing the media's impact and power over all of us, and the psychological and social implications that it may have. The film also reflects real fears like the spread of propaganda and the dependency we have on media, which perhaps is more prevalent today than ever. The practical effects in this film are highly effective because they do not attempt to convince the audience of familiar realism. Instead, they present something entirely unprecedented, creating a unique visual language that doesn't imitate anything we've seen before. James Wood, who played Max, admittedly felt silly while filming some of these scenes for obvious reasons, but his dedication to these moments is what helps pull off the unsettling atmosphere. Rick Baker, who worked on An American Werewolf in London, which we spoke about earlier, was involved in some of these scenes. In the TV scenes, they created a dental dam material which pulsated using a keyboard organ and air compressor, inflating parts of the TV on command. It's a great example of body horror where we see a subject fused with inanimate objects, but these objects have great power and symbolism for something else. I understand why it's all the way up here. It's very well known, and I'm just glad it's on this list. Next is Slither. Slither is James Gunn's wild, slimy, zombie-ish horror. The film starts much like the Blob, with a meteorite crashing down in South Carolina where an alien parasite infests a local resident. He then proceeds to feast and destroy all life forms in his way. This parasite spreads and affects most townspeople, creating a hive mind under his control. The body horror is actually light on its metaphors. It's a homage to other small town infestation films with a gun twist. Although the film uses a mix of prosthetic effects and digital imagery, a lot of the cool reveals are overshadowed by the CG sluggies, but at the time they were pretty top end. Image Engine animated the parasites using a spline IK based system and applied detailed texturing for realism. Digital Dimension created the gruesome effects like the splitting heads. The visual effects process involved meticulous modeling, animation, and composing to seamlessly integrate the CGI with the live action footage. It is a fun film, but I just don't feel like it held up that well over time. The next film, though, I will defend M. Night until my dying day, but Old was pretty wacky. Old may be a hit and miss in terms of M. Night films, but the story itself leans into body horror in a completely unique way compared to the other films so far on this list. I'm sure if you took a shot every time I said metaphor, you'd be on the floor, but this one is just a blatant look at a topic that is relatable to all humans, their relationship with their body and time. And it explores that in the most uncomfortable way because it's horror. The story follows a family on vacation who are taken to a secluded beach where time causes the occupants to age rapidly. Suddenly, the family and a bunch of other vacationers must band together to try and find a way out before death comes for them. The film explores our relationship with our bodies head on and in every stage as the kids morph before our eyes and other people's bodies give up. The movie, in my opinion, doesn't take itself too seriously, but if it did, it would be a lot more horrifying. In one of the most intense scenes, we see Crystal, played by Abby Lee, succumb to calcium deficiency and her bones literally contort and break away. Time is something we can't get back, and our bodies are our vessels. The film is based on a graphic novel called Sandcastle, which he was gifted on Father's Day. What a great way to celebrate his mortality. I'm actually glad that this one is on the Iceberg because it's a little bit different to the rest. Sorry, I'm feeling so warm on this side of my face. I feel like it's getting worse. Maybe you can't see it. We'll keep an eye on that. Let's go into tier 3, starting with Cabin Fever. This is an interesting entry because it is the Cabin Fever series, and those are 4 very different films. The first one is Eli Roth's original, and the second one is directed by none other than Ty West. And then we have Kare Andrews for Patient Zero, which serves as a prequel. And then Travis Z remade the original in 2016. The original idea was inspired by a skin infection that Eli Roth had. Eli Roth and I might have that in common right now. He had this when he was traveling, and he wrote it into a film about a group of friends who stay at a cabin in the woods where their trip turns sinister when they encounter a flesh-eating virus that spreads among them. The first film centered around the name itself, cabin fever, which is usually a psychological term, where in this film the danger is very much contagious and physical, although of course being infected can cause psychological damage. Unfortunately, this makes no sense in the second film as we move to a high school prom. If the name of this franchise is so disconnected to what it turned into, when Eli Roth had his skin condition, he was traveling around Iceland and felt very isolated. In these films, that's not the case. The gore is pretty intense, especially in the original film, but it is quite inconsistent between the films. If only there was a film that was about being completely solo and cut off from the world, isolated while going through this experience, but there are some noteworthy visual effects in this series. Interesting enough, my favorite has to come from Patient Zero, where we see this amazing prosthetic. And I don't think I can show this one to you on YouTube, but let's just say he is decaying in the worst way possible, and his jaw and eye in the wrong place. If you're into dumb, fun gore, then these films are probably worth your time, but I'm personally not a big fan. But in saying all of that, now I have to admit, I am a fan of the next series, and a lot of people are not. Let's talk about Human Centipede. I have done numerous videos on Tom Six's satire nightmare, and I get it. It's a lot, which is kind of the point. The idea stemming from the worst things imaginable that you could do to a person for punishment. The first film features Dieter Laser as a mad surgeon who uses people as guinea pigs in a wild experiment, creating a continuous digestive system throughout a group of people. It is sick, it's over the top, and it is pure body horror. The second film follows a new villain who is inspired by the first film and recreates the design. And the third one is a recasting of the characters from the first two films into a prison setting where they use the design to make the biggest centipede to date with prisoners. As the films go on, somehow they manage to outdo each other, getting more and more shocking. I don't think that there's any taboo topic that these films don't cover. As for the actual approach to the visual aspect of body horror, there's surprisingly not much they have to do, maybe a little bit around the mouth, but it's insinuated how they're connected. And there's not really a lot of gruesome parts in the body element. I would say there's other things that come into play, but the continuation itself is inferred. We do see some graphic elements with the faces, but I like that they could hide just the idea in plain sight. The film is the most extreme example in losing body autonomy and explores the primal fears of imprisonment and dehumanization. And it gets even more dark because the idea of survival in this film is by taking one's own self out. Don't get me wrong, I know that this series is completely over the top, but hey, at least it's an original take on our relationship with losing ourselves and what that truly means. Look at me getting deep about Human Centipede. Actually, it's one of my favorite topics, but I would probably put this further down because I know a lot of people have no desire to watch it and seek it out. I also have a soft spot for this next film, The Ruins, not only because it stars Jenna Malone and it's a 2000s horror, but because it's a teen horror that actually has a good message. The film is based on a novel of the same name and follows 4 young tourists who travel to Mexico. They plan to just party during their vacation, but on their last day, they are convinced to go along with another tourist they meet to a cultural site. Without doing any research, they approach an ancient Mayan ruin and are attacked by locals. They climb up the ruin where they remain as the locals gather below, surrounding them. But what's already with them is what they should be afraid of. The twist in this film is that the locals at the start were attempting to warn them. The ruin is covered in a carnivorous vine, and once you touch this vine, it's game over. It will consume you slowly, and it picks off the group one by one in the most gruesome of ways. It grows into their bodies, planting aerial roots into the flesh. Many of the injuries are applied with vine props and makeup, while other attack scenes with the vines are primarily CGI. It's gory, but I still find it to be one of the lighter body horror films. Although there is a moment where one of the girls attempts to cut her flesh off. The message is about destruction of an environment and history by tourists. It can also be defined as an eco-horror, probably more than body. It's about ignorance, and it's clever in its delivery, as we as the audience can only understand what's happening from the tourist perspective until we put the clues together. But there's not a lot of transformation in the body horror aspect, more being attacked. I'd probably remove this one from the list altogether, but if you haven't seen it, I recommend it. The Return of the Living Dead 1985 is a cult classic zombie horror comedy that introduced the new idea of brain-eating zombies, and people also claim that it birthed the idea of the death by headshot. Who says that horror comedies don't have an impact on horror lore? Because this one does. The plot follows a chaotic night when toxic gas is accidentally released from military drums in a warehouse, reviving a cadaver and leading to a spread when it gets into a nearby cemetery. The movie's practical effects were inspired by a lot of things, including EC Comics artwork. The zombies were brought to life by practical makeup and effects. The most significant aspect of the Return of the Living Dead in terms of body horror is the depiction of zombies craving brains. And this is to help relieve their suffering. This theme is uncommon in other body horror films because it flips horror rules on its head. Now, death is not the ultimate escape from a horrific, unbearable situation. Beneath its comedic surface lies a dark scenario, being trapped in a state of decaying awareness, craving relief with only a headshot as your true escape. Honestly, it's not a graphic film. It's kind of funny. I want to know what your thoughts are on zombie films being considered body horror. I do think it's important to the genre, especially this one, so I'm glad it's here, but it could have been put up a little bit higher. Next, we have another David Cronenberg film, Scanners. This centers around psychics called scanners who have telepathic and telekinetic powers. These powers allow them to control minds and inflict physical harm to their victims. The story follows a man who is trained to infiltrate and stop a powerful scanner, but this movie is known for its epic head explosion scene, which happens within the first 15 minutes of the film. It's become an iconic moment in horror, and this was created by using gelatin encased plaster packed with meat, latex scraps, and wax to create mixed textures that would expel in different ways. But how they got it to explode was trial and error. Ultimately, it was decided that the special effects supervisor, Gary Zeller, would shoot the prop in the back of the head to get this explosion effect. It was completed 4 different times just in case, but Cronenberg was happy with the first take. Unfortunately, the end product was trimmed down to achieve the R rating. Ultimately, it's an examination of the intersection of mind, body, and technology, encapsulated in a visceral shock of its most famous moment. But the ending also has some important body horror, as we see the hero and villain combined together as one through scanning. This shows their brains and faces warping together due to their telepathic powers. But besides this moment, a lot of the torment and horror is psychological. Daddy Cronenberg might be the master of body horror, but in this film he had other focuses. But you know what film I absolutely adore that is 100% body horror, no ifs, whats about it? Tusk. This quirky comedy horror directed by Kevin Smith follows Wallace, an arrogant podcast host whose upcoming interview falls through, and in a bid to replace the story, he places trust in a stranger. And Wallace, accustomed to being unchecked in his ego, soon meets his match when his new interviewee reveals a bizarre obsession. In a twisted turn of events, Wallace is drugged and undergoes a grotesque transformation into a walrus. The film is undeniably goofy, yet the horror resonates in a similar way to the Human Centipede films by tapping into the primal fear of losing bodily autonomy. Maybe that's why I like both of these films so much. For me, it also serves as almost a didactic, cautionary tale about arrogance. When you constantly view yourself as the predator and the world is the prey, you're bound to encounter someone who flips the script. Wallace's transformation in this film evolves at a slow and steady pace. In fact, a lot of this film is just conversations between the stranger and Wallace. But when he does take his final form, it is shocking. They use practical effects, including a detachable mask, bringing unsettling realism to his grotesque new form. The entire concept is both horrific and absurd, and it offers a clear message. Wallace's ego and sense of invincibility led him into this nightmare, waltzing into a stranger's home without considering the consequences. It's a compelling, dramatic arc with an almost tragic sense of irony. We're almost at the end of tier 3, and here is Ginger Snaps. I didn't necessarily think of Ginger Snaps as a body horror, but in doing this video, I realized I might be wrong about that assumption. The teen supernatural horror starring Catherine Isabelle is about 2 sisters who are obsessed with death. But when one sister, Ginger, gets bitten by a creature, she begins a transformation. The film coincides with her first period, using it as an allegory for puberty. And Ginger gets an American Werewolf-inspired transformation, turning from a cute nerdy goth into a fox eye it girl. I love the slow-mo down the hall. But it also extends beyond that for her final form. This movie is so clear with its metaphor, but its edgy humor and bond of sisterhood is what makes it a 2000s classic. It's been good to see a lot of films on this iceberg so far have favored traditional practical effects, and Ginger Snaps is no different, but they did face a lot of hardships, with the lead spending several hours getting prosthetics applied. She also couldn't see well because because of the eye contacts, and the prosthetics around her mouth and nose made it so she had a constant dripping nose while she was performing. So imagine trying to act as a werewolf hybrid while your nose is constantly running. But luckily it paid off because the film still looks great coming on to 25 years later. I guess it's more obscure than American Werewolf, but I still think of it as a horror household name. I'm kind of grateful it's here. It's reframed its attribution to body horror in my mind. Our last one for tier 3 is Color Out of Space, which was kind of confusing for me, but it makes sense again. It's something that reframed how I saw the genre in my head, because I thought of Color Out of Space as more of a cosmic horror, but it really is very much a body horror as well. Color Out of Space blends cosmic horror and body horror into a visceral nightmare based on the short story of the same name by H.P. Lovecraft. After Teresa, who is a mother and wife of a family, undergoes a mastectomy, they move to a remote farm to heal. But a meteorite that crashes unleashes a mysterious yet beautiful force. This film is a true representation of body horror, with the family dealing with the mother's cancer diagnosis and treatment. The color represents the changes that happen to them all in body and soul. The movie unfolds as the Gardner family succumbs to the horrific transformations. It's a wild descent into madness and a grotesque fusion. The film connects the themes of environmental decay and personal loss to relate to broader contemporary issues. We see how vulnerable our bodies and minds can be when facing overwhelming challenges from external forces. There are some great challenges when bringing a story like this from page to screen, because we're seeing a color that is not actually visible to the human eye. They had to represent an alien force that is not in our spectrum. For an independent film, it's a huge feat, and the body horror element is superb. It's a great representation on why body horror as a subgenre is so powerful. For that reason, I kind of find this film to be underrated. I think it's pretty good. We're on to tier 4, which will be the final tier today. And we're starting with Cargo. I'm a little perplexed that this is this far down, and that's coming for someone who is proud that this is an Australian horror film, but it just doesn't feel like a deep cut body horror. The post-apocalyptic horror action based on the short film of the same name is a sad and desperate story of survival, as Martin Freeman plays a father struggling to protect his baby in outback Australia that is overtaken by a rabid virus. The film has a lot of similar themes to A Quiet Place, with family and sacrifice during a dark time. The body horror in Cargo is subtly woven through its portrayal of infection and transformation. The film leverages emotional and physical decay to unsettle, but the body horror is prevalent in the unique rules within this virus. It's kind of like Return of the Living Dead in a way. It has its own rules that are just for this virus, because once you get it, there's a strict countdown in the transformation period, and it slowly strips away your control, deteriorating the body and mind. Like a zombie bite, you're aware that you're done, but in this one, there's a specific countdown till you succumb to the infection, so you can time it out. And the film is about giving up to this and surrendering yourself, but then also, how do you use your last hours? How can you protect and make it better for the ones you love? So the theme rings true to the core values of body horror. We watch the decay of a human and how it changes them in more ways than just physical. It's one of the saddest films on this list by far, and I bawled when I watched this for the first time. You've been warned. It's another that didn't initially come to mind when I thought about the subgenre, but it's a great example of a tragic, unique transformation. Next, we have The Blob. Sorry, I'm getting really hot, but this one is the remake of the 50s classic. It follows the same story of a small town's encounter with an amoeba-like organism that crashes to Earth via a military satellite. And the remake turns it up several notches with its enhanced body horror elements, most of which were really groundbreaking for its time. The director Chuck Russell explained that we wanted to show a death in a way that is both horrifying and strangely beautiful. Do you guys think this is beautiful? You be the judge. The film's practical effects were managed by Tony Gardner and his team, and they utilized translucent materials in these scenes, allowing the viewers to see the victims' faces contort in agony. Unlike the original, the remake of The Blob reflects a cynical era. Rather than an alien invader, it's revealed that the Blob is a Cold War experiment gone wrong, and the government's pursuit to contain the Blob, no matter the cost, deepens the film's critique of authority and human experimentation. The director has said that the Blob represents more than a monster. It symbolizes the breakdown of the trust in institutions. The film's body horror elements are beyond impressive, and the message behind it is a loss of control within our place in society. No matter what, there's an overarching power calling the shots, and our fate is in their hands. It couldn't be more appropriate today. The gruesome remake represents body horror in the most horrendously glorious way possible. Splinter is next, and I'm actually surprised Teeth is not on this list. I'm going to talk about a few films that are not on this list at the end that I don't know why they weren't here. But when I think of Splinter, I also think of Teeth, and I don't know how Teeth isn't on this list and Splinter is. But let's talk about Splinter. Splinter is the indie horror that is known for its gruesome practical effects and original creature design. The film follows a group that take refuge in a gas station after encountering a parasitic organism that manipulates and distorts its body's hosts in grotesque ways. The director was drawn to the idea of a creature that commands rather than kills, inspired by The Thing. The infection makes these human bodies move in unnatural and horrifying ways, and this was choreographed with the help of gymnasts and mimes to enhance the eerie effect. Another win for horror fans, the director and his team were adamant to pull off these gruesome scenes, prioritizing practical effects, noting CGI would have detracted from the visceral nature that we wanted. The film has a lot of shocking moments, such as an arm amputation to prevent spread, which honestly with this list, is not that far-fetched. The message is one of survival as the humans struggle against an uncontrollable invasive force threatening all of humanity. Ultimately, the body horror in Splinter is about the relentless fight against unknowable evil, blending physical and psychological terror with unique visuals. In terms of body horror, it is grim and it will make your skin crawl, which is important to me. Next, Altered States. This is a little bizarre because it's a Ken Russell film. It's actually adapted from a novel, and it's a hallmark of sci-fi horror, blending psychological, philosophical, and body horror elements. The story follows the life of a psychopathologist who experiments with drugs and sensory deprivation tanks, which results in not only psychological damage, but drastic, grotesque transformations. The movie follows him over time through marriage, health issues, and his quest for answers about our state of consciousness. The film draws on sensory deprivation research from John C. Lilly, who explored altered consciousness states with psychedelics. The film has a haunting tone full of dread, and its imagery matches that. Along with the Ken Russell special, it's got a lot of religious imagery. But the body horror elements don't take place until almost an hour in, when he has a horrific reaction to an experiment with an untested drug, resulting in a psychological break where he sees and feels his body contorting and transforming. From here, it's all downhill as he transforms into a primate-like creature, and finally, in an epic conclusion, he becomes, well, this, an altered state of being. The transformations in this film are obscure, unique, and alarming, but the focus is more so on his mental state, using the visuals to back up this grotesque metaphor, with the epic finale being a warning to unchecked scientific ambition, and of course, the power and fragility of the human mind. The next film is a hit and miss for a lot of people. It divides horror fans. I would love to know which side you're on. For the Void. This movie is inspired by Lovecraft elements, and it's set in a hospital where we follow a deputy who confronts a cult whose attacks create monstrous transformations, blurring the line between reality and surrealism, leading back to a doctor with a dark secret. The film's reliance on its practical effects showcases its commitment to body horror, invoking a spirit of 1980s horror classics. One of the directors stated that we wanted to make a legitimate horror movie that is influenced by all things we like, but it isn't jokey homage. These elements really do reflect Lovecraftian themes. You've got madness, cosmic dread, and I'm just gonna say it, good old-fashioned tentacles. But it's the medical transformation that is revealed by the doctor which shows the true body horror elements. The film was partially funded through crowdfunding, allowing this indie project to have real, elaborate practical elements, including all the gore texture and details. There are so many unique body horror moments that are found in the basement, and the movement of these entities makes my skin crawl. One thing I think that is great about this film is they utilize the budget where it's needed for the practical effects, but they also infer gore in one of the most intense traumatic scenes where we see a vicious attack about to happen and we just get to see the outside of the door, and the way it's inferred is just chef's kiss. But its final monster takes the cake in the horrific birthing scene. The monster is a feat itself in the way that the practical suit was created. With all of these different modules, it is a logistical wonder, and it truly gives you an appreciation for the time spent getting the gore right in this film. The actors commented on how the effects were so genius that they barely needed to act horrified. The visuals themselves were terrifying. The film explores the loss of one's identity through physical mutation, which is akin to joining a cult and losing one's individuality. Say what you want about the storyline. I know I've said my piece on a review years ago. It may be an ambiguous journey, but the horror elements shine on their own, making it a great addition for body horror. The next film, I'm really not sure if it's body horror, but it is terrifying in its own way. Possession is a complicated film. The film explores the breakdown in a marriage after Mark returns from a long absence, and the relationship between him and his wife, Anna, begins to deteriorate after she is found having an affair. Their emotional turmoil is displayed through numerous melodramatically physical and horrifically violent scenes. Both have a descent into madness over their decaying relationship, and Mark starts seeing his wife within another woman, their son's teacher, who appears as her doppelganger. Like I said, the film is complicated. And Isabelle Adjani shines as Anna in some iconic sequences that went down not just in horror history, but in film history. The movie is known for its psychological approach, but it does have some intense body horror elements. Anna is not only cheating on Mark with a man, but she's also having this ongoing affair with a tentacle-like substance entity that is living in her secret apartment. And her obsession with this entity changes her, driving her to kill to protect it. As the film progresses, this creature continues to grow and soon becomes human-like, transforming into a doppelganger of Mark. The entity is bizarre and terrifying, and it's one of the most unique monsters, but somehow it fits in place with the rest of the offbeat dramatic performances. It's a weird connection between this supernatural, strange entity and the realism within the film. We don't see a lot of the entity, but what we do see is shocking, and the movie has a lot of mixed messages and themes which are left up to the audience's interpretation. Although there's been some great breakdowns online, it's a bizarre film with eccentric performances, and ultimately it's about the breakdown of a relationship and the idea of possessing another person. I do see the film as more of a psychological oddity than a body horror, but it is well worth a watch. Okay, The Brood is actually my favorite Cronenberg film, 100%. It is the one I always go back to. Even though I love Videodrome, there is something about The Brood. Well, let's talk about it. The movie is said to be inspired by Cronenberg's own divorce and custody battle. It channels his personal anguish and repressed rage into a story about Frank, a man who tries to stop his mentally ill wife from being treated by an unconventional and eccentric psychologist. And as soon mysterious figures appear and they start trying to harm the people involved in Frank's life. The figures are ultimately revealed to be connected to the therapy program, and it's a manifestation of her own trauma caused by childhood abuse, which is a cycle that has been continued. They are part of her ongoing rage. Reborn, now attacking those who have harmed her. Are you with me still? Psychologist Dr. Raglan has done this to other patients, creating an infliction that is known as psychoplasmic. Its aim is to help the patients with mental issues by releasing their suppressed emotions through physiological changes in their body. It doesn't get much more body horror than that. Trauma literally presenting itself on your body for everyone to see. The film's iconic peak is its climax in a rage birth scene where Samantha Eggers gives a masterful and unforgettable performance that is particularly grim when she licks her own strange newborns clean. It's primal and grotesque. Cronenberg remarked, "I had a long, loving close-up of Samantha licking the fetus. When censors cut it out, a lot of people thought she was eating her baby, which is much worse than I was suggesting. Ultimately, the Brood links the body's transformation to deep psychological wounds. Its unsettling portrayal of family trauma paired with Cronenberg's fearless exploration of the grotesque creates the horror, a defining film for the body horror genre, linking the trauma metaphor to the body directly. Okay, onto something a lot less serious. The Toxic Avenger. This is the cult classic horror comedy that put trauma entertainment on the map. Infamously low budget and goofy outrageous, this film fuses splatter, comedy, and body horror into a chaotic story that flips conventional horror tropes. The story follows Melvin, a scrawny, socially awkward janitor in Tromaville. He becomes the Toxic Avenger after falling into a drum of toxic waste, and the accident burns his skin and mutates him into a hulking, disfigured superhero with strength and a newfound taste for justice. One of the co-directors commented that they took the themes of classic monster movies and turned them up to 11. All the elements of this film are exaggerated, including the body count, which is 27. Yes, 27. I have such a soft spot for this film. It is brutally camp, and usually I don't like slapstick, but it's just so fun. The transformation process included several different parts of the costume being layered on top of the actor. The most important thing for Toxie, as they call him, is the texture, and the design team did so well in deepening the parts of the mask to create the illusion of stretched skin. Toxie is so important not just to body horror, but to horror in general. It's the story of the underdog, the nerd, the outcast, something that a lot of horror fans feel attached to, and it's flipped on its head where he becomes this new type of superhero. Although the damage to his body is horrific in this film, we are able to see the positive in the transformation. Toxie is a true good for him film, and we don't have a lot of them. As mentioned, the film became a cult classic beyond its initial release, spawning sequels, a comedy series, and even a children's cartoon, Toxic Crusaders. Despite it being a satirical take on superheroes and OG monster films, the film's portrayal of body horror carries real weight, encapsulating the fear of one's loss of control over their own physical form. The exaggerated transformations and gory spectacles serve as metaphors for reclaiming agency, showing that even people with the most grotesque changes can rise to heroism in the most absurd ways possible. We're at the last film of tier 4, and I can't believe it, but also my face is burning. I'm not sure if you can see in the camera, but I feel like watching all of these body horror films has had a profound effect on me physically. So let's talk about a romantic body horror, Spring. Spring has a very similar approach to Splice in its body horror elements, but like Cargo, it's more of a soft approach because this sci-fi is a romance horror. Spoilers ahead, this is a Benson and Moorhead film, so expect the unexpected, which is exactly what our protagonist Evan fails to do. When he flees to Italy to escape his problems, he meets a mysterious woman harboring a dark secret. It turns out she's a 2,000-year-old mutant creature that recreates herself every 20th spring. She also reveals that if she falls in love, her process is terminated and she will become mortal. She must now decide between immortality and love. The film reflects the complexities in sacrifice for love. It is an independent film that mixes a lot of props and CGI. Luckily, in its weaker moments, the performances really do steal the show. Benson said in an interview that body horror often explores our deepest fears of the body's betrayal. We wanted to explore how it intersects with love and identity. What sets Spring apart is its balance between horror and genuine emotional connection. But also we watched a human struggle with someone else's transformation, which is only natural to them. It adds another distinctive perspective to the body horror genre, which I'm realizing through this video seems to offer a lot more interpretations than I first initially thought. This is truly giving me a whole new appreciation for body horror, but I'm gonna go have a shower and try and see if I can put some cream on this because it's becoming a situation. So let's stop the video here and we'll be back for part 2 very soon. If you guys did like this video, let me know down in the comments. It helps when you share it with a friend. And don't forget, of course, Daddy Cronenberg shirts are available right now on Spookyastronauts.com. Thank you so much for being here. I can't wait to continue our journey. Stay safe and stay spooky. Bye, friends.